here are the stories shaping the world this Sunday morning, June 21st. The United States and Iran are entering a new round of negotiations in Switzerland after signing a memorandum meant to end their fighting. But the path to a final agreement is already being tested by the Strait of Hormuz, Lebanon, and the unresolved question of Iran's nuclear program. The talks are set to begin Sunday, with Geneva and a summit near Lake Lucerne, both part of the diplomatic picture. The memorandum gives Washington and Tehran 60 days to negotiate a final deal. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance has arrived in Switzerland, while U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have been preparing for negotiations. Iran's delegation includes Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Pakistan and Qatar are involved as mediators. The immediate complication is Iran's renewed closure of the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important energy shipping routes. Iran's Central Military Command said the strait would be closed because, in Tehran's view, Washington had failed to implement the memorandum and Israel was continuing strikes in Lebanon. Iran says those strikes violate the ceasefire understanding. The memorandum calls for an end to military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon. A Reuters report quoted a U.S. Central Command spokesperson saying Iran does not control the Strait of Hormuz and that the U.S. military considers the waterway open. That disagreement matters far beyond the diplomatic table. The strait is a narrow passage for oil and gas shipments that affect fuel prices, shipping costs, and household budgets across many countries. At least 16 people have been reported killed in southern Lebanon despite a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. Neither Israel nor Hezbollah is described as a party to the U.S.-Iran ceasefire deal, but the violence is still affecting the political climate around the talks. For civilians in southern Lebanon, the distinction between different diplomatic tracks offers little comfort when strikes continue and families are trying to decide whether it is safe to stay, leave, or rebuild. The nuclear issue also remains unresolved. The memorandum has created a window for diplomacy, but technical questions over how to curb Iran's nuclear program have not yet been settled. The constructive opening is that both sides are still sending senior officials to negotiate, with regional mediators at the table. The risk is that military action in Lebanon, shipping pressure in Hormuz, and mistrust over implementation could narrow that opening quickly. The disruption in the Strait of Hormuz is also leaving thousands of seafarers stranded on ships in and around the waterway, turning a geopolitical dispute into a daily welfare crisis for workers at sea. Phil Belcher, Marine Director of the International Association of Independent Tanker Owners, known as Intertanko, said about 20,000 seafarers was about the right number for those affected. He said some traffic has resumed since the memorandum, but hundreds of ships remain backed up. And a full return to normal service is expected to take weeks, not days. Belcher said 16 seafarers had lost their lives in the conflict, killed by both Iran and the United States. He also described serious mental welfare pressures for crews who have seen attacks and airstrikes while still being expected to keep ships operating. These are workers living for weeks in confined spaces, far from families, often with limited control over where they go and when they can leave. The practical problems are significant. Belcher said the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and other states have been helping provide food, water, and normal supplies. That support matters because seafarers are not just waiting in line. They need medicine, fuel, rest, communication with families, and safe routes in and out. Belcher said some northern route passages were likely subject to fees paid to regional authorities or to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, though he said this was not certain and it was unclear who paid. He said the southern route, facilitated by the United States, was free of fees and tolls, but had faced almost daily attacks. About 5 ships out of roughly 200 on the southern route were hit during that period, according to Belcher. There has been some improvement. Since the memorandum, Belcher said no ships had been attacked in the previous 3 days. Recent passage numbers included about 30 ships one night, 16 the night before, and 15 the night before that. But the backlog remains large. He said roughly 550 ships were still in the Gulf, with a similar number needing to enter to load oil and gas. For shipping companies, delays mean financial losses and scheduling chaos. For consumers, they can eventually mean higher prices. But for the crews themselves, the main question is more basic: when they can move safely, when they can get home, and whether the people negotiating from capitals are fully accounting for the workers caught in between. A broader assessment of the US-Iran memorandum suggests that Tehran may have gained leverage from the conflict, even after suffering heavy damage from aerial bombing and economic pressure. In a France 24 interview, one analyst described the memorandum as strategically favorable to Iran. The argument was that Washington and Israel did not achieve their war aims, while Iran showed it could use the Strait of Hormuz to put pressure on global energy markets and the wider global economy. That leverage is now hanging over the negotiations in Switzerland. Donald Trump was described as having initially demanded unconditional surrender from Tehran. He later signed a 14-point memorandum of understanding with Iran in Versailles. The shift from maximal public demands to negotiated terms is now being read by some observers as evidence that military force did not produce the political outcome Washington sought. The memorandum is also being described as vague on the nuclear issue and silent on Iran's proxies, including Hezbollah and Hamas. Trump was cited as saying Iran should be allowed to have some missiles. That leaves major questions about what a final deal would actually contain, how it would be verified, and whether it would reduce the risk of future conflict for people across the region. Iran has paid a major price. The country was battered by aerial bombing and hurt by an economic blockade. The same assessment said 135 Iranian leaders were killed, reshaping the leadership structure inside the country. A new generation is said to be emerging, more pragmatic in some ways, but also more hawkish. Iran remains authoritarian and is described as being more directly run by the Revolutionary Guard. That matters for ordinary Iranians as much as for foreign governments. Sanctions, blockades, and military escalation fall heavily on workers, families, students, and small businesses. A leadership shaped by war may be less willing to compromise publicly, even when the public needs economic relief and basic stability. The hopeful part, if there is one, is that the memorandum has created a defined 60-day period for negotiation rather than open-ended escalation. But the substance still matters. A durable agreement would need to address nuclear limits, regional security, shipping safety, and civilian protection in ways that are clear enough to be implemented, not just announced. Poland says it is revoking its highest state honor from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, opening a painful dispute between two neighboring countries that have been closely aligned since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The honor is the Order of the White Eagle, which Zelensky received in 2023. Poland says it is revoking the award after Ukraine named Special Operations Forces after a World War II-era militant group accused of massacring Poles. Polish President Karol Nawrocki called the name change, outrageous, and deeply disappointing. Ukraine's foreign minister criticized the Polish decision, saying the Polish president had made a strategic mistake that benefits Russia. That warning reflects the wider concern. Moscow has repeatedly looked for ways to divide Ukraine from its European supporters, and historical wounds can be especially difficult to manage when both countries are under pressure. Poland has been one of Ukraine's most important supporters since the start of Russia's invasion. It has hosted refugees, served as a logistical hub, and backed Kiev diplomatically and militarily. Those ties have had real consequences for ordinary people. Ukrainian families seeking safety in Polish towns and cities, Polish communities managing the costs of support, and workers on both sides whose lives have been reshaped by the war. The dispute also comes as Poland is set to host an international conference beginning Thursday on Ukraine's recovery. That meeting is intended to focus on rebuilding, the long, expensive work of restoring homes, schools, hospitals, power systems, and jobs. The controversy over the state honor could complicate the atmosphere around that effort. The history at the center of the dispute is serious. For many Poles, wartime massacres are not symbolic issues, but family history. For Ukrainians, military naming and national memory have often been shaped by the struggle for independence, and now by resistance to Russian aggression. A constructive path would require both governments to avoid using history as a weapon while still taking victims' memories seriously. For Ukraine, maintaining trust with Poland is strategically important. For Poland, supporting Ukraine while defending its own historical memory is a difficult political balance. The coming recovery conference may test whether the two governments can keep the argument from damaging practical cooperation that millions of people still depend on. Colombia is holding a presidential runoff Sunday between right-wing lawyer Abelardo de la Espriella and leftist Senator Iván Cepeda, after a first vote on May 31st ended in a tie. The campaign is centered on security, drug trafficking, the wealth gap, and Colombia's relationship with the Trump administration. Colombia is a major producer of the main ingredient in cocaine, and armed groups connected to the drug trade remain a central challenge in many regions. For families in rural areas, that can mean extortion, forced recruitment, displacement, or living under the authority of armed groups rather than the state. De la Espriella is backed by U.S. President Donald Trump. He advocates closer cooperation with the Trump administration and says he would restore order by attacking armed groups involved in drug trafficking. His supporters argue that Colombia needs a harder security approach after years of violence and criminal control in some areas. Cepeda wants to continue President Gustavo Petro's policy of dialogue with armed groups. That approach is based on the idea that violence cannot be solved by force alone and that negotiated exits can reduce harm to civilians. Critics say dialogue can give armed groups time and legitimacy without guaranteeing that communities become safer. The Trump administration has imposed sanctions on Petro, adding another layer to the election. Analysts are watching whether the result will increase U.S. influence in South America. Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia have been cited as countries that have shifted away from leftist governments toward pro-U.S. right-wing or centrist leadership. But for most Colombians, the election is not only about ideology or Washington's influence. It is about whether children can get to school safely, whether farmers can sell crops without paying armed groups, whether young people can find work outside illegal economies, and whether the state can provide services in places where it has long been absent. The wealth gap is another major issue. Colombia has modern cities and strong economic sectors, but inequality remains deeply felt. A security policy that does not address poverty, land access, education, and jobs may struggle to last. At the same time, social programs are harder to deliver where armed groups control territory. Sunday's runoff offers two sharply different paths: a more forceful alignment with Trump's regional strategy, or a continuation of Petro's dialogue-based approach. The outcome will matter for Colombia's security, for U.S.-Latin America relations, and for communities that have lived for decades with the consequences of both violence and neglect. Hiroshima survivor Setsuko Thurlow is again calling for the total abolition of nuclear weapons, using speeches in Austria to urge young people to learn the history of nuclear war and turn that knowledge into action. Thurlow is 94 and lives in Canada. She was 13 when she survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in 1945. She lost many classmates in the attack. Her life's work has been shaped by that experience, and she later contributed to the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Since mid-June, Thurlow has been giving speeches in Austria, one of the country's leading international nuclear disarmament efforts. On Thursday in Vienna, she spoke to students and citizens. Her message was direct. The lesson of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that humanity must move urgently away from reliance on nuclear weapons. Her appeal comes at a time when nuclear risks are again part of major global tensions, from arms modernization to conflicts involving nuclear-armed states. But Thurlow's framing is not abstract. She speaks as someone who saw classmates killed, a city destroyed, and survivors left to carry physical and emotional wounds for the rest of their lives. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has been supported by many non-nuclear states and civil society groups, though nuclear-armed countries and many of their allies have not joined it. Supporters say the treaty creates a moral and legal standard against weapons that can cause catastrophic civilian harm. Critics argue that disarmament cannot be separated from current security threats. Thurlow's focus on young people is important. Nuclear policy is often treated as the domain of experts, militaries, and governments. Her argument is that citizens also have a role, especially those who will live with the consequences of decisions made today. She expressed hope that campaigns to abolish nuclear weapons will spread, especially among younger generations. In a week dominated by hard security stories, her message is a reminder that prevention is also policy. Arms control, diplomacy, education, and public pressure may not produce instant results, but they can shape what governments consider acceptable. Thurlow's testimony keeps the human cost at the center of a debate too often reduced to strategy and numbers. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has pushed back against Donald Trump after what was described as repeated unprovoked attacks, calling them senseless. Meloni, who leads Italy's government, was responding to Trump's criticism, including an earlier social media post. The exchange is notable because both leaders are associated with the political right, and Meloni has often been watched closely for how she navigates relations with Trump and with the broader European Union. Her response was firm but limited. By calling the attack senseless, Meloni signaled that Italy's government does not intend to absorb personal criticism without reply. At the same time, the dispute has not been framed as a break in relations between Italy and the United States. For European governments, the challenge is practical. They need working relationships with Washington on defense, trade, energy, migration, and Ukraine, regardless of political disagreements or personal attacks. For workers and families, those relationships can affect jobs, prices, security commitments, and public budgets. Meloni's rebuke also reflects a wider reality for U.S. allies. Many are trying to preserve cooperation with the Trump administration while also defending their own national interests and political dignity. That balancing act is especially important in Europe, where governments are already managing war-related costs, energy pressures, and debates over defense spending. The constructive signal is that public disagreement does not have to end diplomacy. Allies can push back, set boundaries, and still keep channels open. In a tense international moment, that kind of steadiness matters. Follow for a daily world brief. Sources are linked in the comment. That's the world, as Minerva saw it.